At my sister's engagement party, my mother shoved me into the freezing pool, laughing that I didn't belong in their wealthy new world. She thought she finally broke me, so I signaled the billionaire who truly owned her fragile reality. This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. My lungs felt as though they were lined with crushed glass. Every breath I drew in the dimly lit silence of my small apartment was a ragged, painful effort that rattled in my chest. I had been battling a severe case of pneumonia for a week, confined to my bed, surrounded by discarded tissues, half-empty mugs of lukewarm tea, and a mounting sense of isolation. The doctor had been very clear: absolute rest, no stress, and a strict regimen of antibiotics. My body was entirely depleted, running on fumes and sheer willpower. I was 30 years old, but in that moment, shivering under two heavy down comforters, I felt like a fragile, hollowed-out shell of myself. The pale, gray light of a rainy Tuesday morning filtered through the blinds, casting long, dreary shadows across the hardwood floor. I reached a trembling hand toward my nightstand to grab my glass of water, my joints aching with the effort. As my fingers brushed the cold glass, the harsh, sudden buzzing of my cell phone shattered the quiet of the room. The screen illuminated, glaring brightly in the dimness. It was an automated text message from my bank, a fraud alert regarding a massive, unusual transaction on my secondary savings account. This was the account I had maintained for years as an emergency safety net. It was a joint account, a terrible relic from my early 20s when I had naively believed my family needed a shared pool of funds for dire situations. I hadn't touched it in almost a year, carefully letting the interest compound, building a wall of financial security against a world that had always felt unstable. Frowning, I blinked against the harsh light of the screen, my fever-addled brain struggling to process the words. I unlocked the phone, my thumb slipping slightly on the glass, and opened the banking application. The little loading circle spun for what felt like an eternity. When the dashboard finally materialized, the numbers hit me with the force of a physical blow. The balance, which had proudly sat at a comfortable, hard-earned sum, was effectively zero. My heart began to hammer erratically against my ribs, making my strained lungs burn even hotter. I navigated to the recent transactions page, my hands shaking so violently I almost dropped the device. There, in stark, digital black and white, was a single, devastating line item: a wire transfer of $45,000. The recipient was listed as Vanderbilt Estate Rentals. For a long, agonizing minute, I simply stared at the screen, unable to breathe, unable to think. My mind scrambled, desperately trying to invent a logical explanation. Had my identity been stolen? Had there been a massive banking error? But the name of the rental company triggered a sickening, cold realization in the pit of my stomach. Isabella, my younger sister, was getting engaged to Preston this coming weekend. They had been complaining for months about finding a venue that was prestigious enough for Preston's wealthy family. The pieces snapped together with terrifying clarity. Beatrice, my mother. She was the only other person whose name was still attached to that old, forgotten joint account. I collapsed back against the pillows, the phone slipping from my numb fingers to land softly on the mattress. All the overtime hours, the late nights spent hunched over delicate canvases with a magnifying glass, the years of skipping vacations and denying myself basic luxuries to build that safety net, gone in a single, unauthorized keystroke. They hadn't asked. They hadn't even hinted at needing a loan. They had simply logged in and taken everything I had, prioritizing a superficial display of wealth for a party over my entire livelihood. A deep, suffocating wave of grief washed over me, pressing down on my chest until I gasped for air. I squeezed my eyes shut, but hot, angry tears leaked out anyway, tracing burning paths down my fever-flushed cheeks. I had sacrificed so much for them, endured so much of their condescension, always hoping that one day they would see my value. Instead, they had stripped me bare without a second thought. As the reality of the theft settled into my aching bones, The physical illness tearing through my body felt entirely secondary. The betrayal was worse than the diagnosis itself. The silence in my apartment, which had felt oppressive just moments ago, now felt thick with an explosive, electric tension. Nausea roiled in my stomach, competing with the fiery ache in my lungs. I forced myself to sit up, my head swimming dizzily. I needed to hear it from her. I needed to hear Beatrice admit what she had done. I picked up the phone, my vision blurring slightly, and tapped my mother's contact name. It rang 3 times. With every ring, the knot of dread in my stomach pulled tighter. "Haley." Beatrice's voice trilled through the speaker, artificially bright and entirely unaffected. "Darling, I'm so glad you called. The caterers are driving me absolutely out of my mind with these caviar substitutions." "Where is my money?" I interrupted, my voice coming out as a raspy, broken croak. I didn't have the energy for pleasantries. I didn't have the breath for a preamble. There was a sharp, sudden pause on the other end of the line. The background noise of rustling fabric and clicking heels ceased. When Beatrice spoke again, the faux sweetness had vanished entirely, replaced by the cold, dismissive tone she reserved exclusively for me. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Haley." "Let's not be dramatic," she sighed, sounding profoundly inconvenienced by my distress. "It wasn't your money. It was in the joint family account. I simply allocated it toward an urgent family need." "An urgent family need." I gasped, clutching my chest as a coughing fit threatened to overwhelm me. "You stole $45,000, my life savings. You transferred it to a luxury estate rental." "Don't use that word. Stole is so ugly and incredibly inaccurate," Beatrice snapped, her voice hardening into a blade. "Isabella is marrying Preston. Do you have any idea who his family is? They are practically royalty in this city. We cannot host them in some drab, middle-class banquet hall. We needed the Vanderbilt property to match their standards. This is an investment in your sister's future, Haley. An investment in our family's social standing." "I am sick, Mother," I whispered, the fight temporarily draining out of me, leaving only a profound, hollow sadness. "I have pneumonia. I haven't been able to work. That money was my security." "You are 30 years old and you play with dusty old paintings for a living," she retorted cruelly, entirely ignoring my illness. "You don't understand how the real world works. You don't understand high society. Isabella is securing a legacy. You should be thanking us for making sure this family isn't completely irrelevant. The account was there to help the family, and that is exactly what it did. Now, I do not have time to coddle your sensitivities. We have the party this Saturday." I was hyperventilating now, my breaths coming in shallow, painful rasps. She wasn't just unrepentant, she felt entirely justified in ruining me to buy an illusion of grandeur. "I'm not going," I choked out. "I'm not coming to a party funded by my stolen money." "You absolutely will be there," Beatrice hissed, a venomous edge to her words. "You will be there because Preston's mother expects to meet Isabella's entire family, and I will not have them asking questions about an estranged, bitter sister. You will come, you will smile, and you will stay in the background where you belong. And please, try to find a dress that doesn't make you look like one of the hired help. Goodbye, Haley." The line went dead. The busy signal blared against my ear, a harsh, mocking sound. I lowered the phone, staring blankly at the wall opposite my bed. The sheer audacity of it was paralyzing. They had taken everything, and they expected me to show up and applaud their theft. I sat there for an hour, the fever making my thoughts swirl in a dizzying vortex of anger, hurt, and profound exhaustion. I thought about the Vanderbilt estate. It was an exclusive, sprawling property, famously difficult to rent, usually reserved for diplomatic events or ultra-elite gatherings. It made sense that Beatrice would obsess over it. It was the ultimate status symbol. I slowly lay back down, pulling the comforter up to my chin. A strange, eerie calm began to wash over me, cooling the burning anger into something much harder, much sharper. Beatrice was right about one thing: I was an art conservator. I spent my life in quiet rooms, meticulously restoring things of value. I was invisible to the people who attended those lavish parties, but they had forgotten one crucial thing. They didn't know who owned the Vanderbilt estate. It was held by a private trust, obscured by layers of corporate entities. But I knew. I knew because I managed the private, multi-million-dollar art collection housed in the estate's restricted East Wing. I knew exactly whose house Beatrice was throwing her stolen money at. The drive to the estate on Saturday evening felt like a funeral procession. The antibiotics had finally started to win the battle against the infection in my lungs, but I was still incredibly weak, my skin pale and drawn. I sat in the back of the rideshare, watching the opulent gates of the Vanderbilt estate loom in the distance. The sheer size of the property was staggering: acres of manicured lawns, fountains illuminated by underwater lights, and the sprawling, classical architecture of the main house glowing warmly against the twilight sky. As the car pulled up to the valet stand, I took a deep, steadying breath. To understand why I was here, why I hadn't simply called the police the moment I saw the bank statement, you had to understand the history of our family. When my father died 10 years ago, he left behind a mountain of secret debt, mostly accrued by Beatrice's extravagant spending and her perpetually failing boutique. I was 20, just starting my apprenticeship in conservation. Isabella was 16 and entirely oblivious to the financial ruin staring us in the face. It fell to me to keep the lights on. I worked exhausting hours, taking on extra commissions, quietly paying off creditors while Beatrice continued to live as if nothing had changed. I funded Isabella's college tuition, paid for her influencer trips, and bilayed Beatrice out time and time again. I did it because I believed, stupidly, that loyalty was reciprocal. I believed that by saving them, they would eventually love me. Walking through the grand oak doors of the mansion, the noise of the party washed over me. A string quartet was playing softly in the corner of the massive foyer. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated with silver trays of champagne. And there, holding court at the edge of the grand ballroom, was Beatrice. She looked entirely in her element, a predator surrounded by prey. Beatrice was a woman who weaponized her appearance. At 55, she was immaculately maintained, her hair perfectly styled into a sleek bob, her rented designer gown clinging to her frame, her jewelry sparkling under the chandeliers. But if you looked closely, as I had all my life, you could see the desperation. Her smile was a tight, calculated mechanism. Her eyes constantly darted around the room, assessing the net worth of everyone she spoke to, categorizing them as useful or irrelevant. She was currently laughing at something Preston, a smug, remarkably unremarkable young man in a bespoke tuxedo, had said. Isabella stood next to him, posing for a photographer, looking like a glossy magazine cutout of a perfect bride-to-be. I hesitated at the edge of the room, hoping to remain unseen, but Beatrice's radar for anything that might disrupt her carefully curated image was flawless. Her eyes locked onto me, and the fake, glittering smile faltered for a fraction of a second before snapping back into place. She excused herself from Preston and marched toward me, her heels clicking aggressively against the marble floor. "You actually came," she said, her voice dropping an octave as she drew near, abandoning the cheerful facade entirely. "You told me I had to," I replied quietly, feeling incredibly small under her piercing gaze. I was wearing a simple, dark green dress, the nicest thing I owned, but clearly out of place among the couture gowns surrounding us. Beatrice's eyes raked over me, cataloging every flaw, every sign of my recent illness. "You look completely washed out, Haley. Are you wearing any makeup at all? You look like a ghost." "I've been sick, Mother, you know that." "I know that you are entirely focused on yourself, as usual," she hissed, stepping closer so her words were for my ears only. "Listen to me very carefully. Preston's parents are the older couple near the ice sculpture. They are old money. They despise anything common. You are not to speak to them. You are not to mention your little restoration hobby. If anyone asks, you are taking a sabbatical to travel. Do you understand?" "You're ashamed of me," I said, the hurt breaking through my carefully constructed numbness. "You steal my money to rent this place, and you're ashamed of me." Beatrice's expression hardened into a mask of pure disdain. "I am managing a delicate situation. Isabella belongs in this world. She has the grace and the beauty for it. You chose a life of dusty isolation. Don't punish your sister just because you lack ambition. Now, get a drink, stand in the corner, and try not to embarrass us." She turned on her heel and glided back toward the center of the room, instantly transforming back into the charming, affluent hostess she was pretending to be. I stood there, trembling slightly, watching her revel in the stolen luxury. She was so confident in her deception, so deeply invested in the lie she was telling this room full of strangers. She truly believed she held all the cards. I retreated to a quiet alcove near the sprawling French doors, the rhythmic thumping of the bass from the ballroom feeling like a physical assault against my still recovering lungs. I pressed my back against the cool, silk-lined wallpaper and closed my eyes. Beatrice's cruel words echoed in my mind, a relentless loop of disparagement. You chose a life of dusty isolation. Don't punish your sister just because you lack ambition. For a moment, the old, familiar urge to flee washed over me. I wanted to crawl back into my small apartment, pull the heavy comforters over my head, and mourn the loss of my financial security in private. But as I took a deep, shuddering breath of the floral-scented air, something shifted within me. The crushing weight of victimization began to fracture, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. I was not a helpless child anymore, begging for scraps of maternal affection. I was a professional. I was meticulous. I uncovered hidden layers and restored the truth for a living. And Beatrice had made a catastrophic miscalculation. She assumed my job was merely playing with dusty old paintings. She didn't know that my primary client, the man who trusted me implicitly with his most prized possessions, was Julian Vance. And she certainly didn't know that Julian Vance, through a labyrinth of holding companies, owned the Vanderbilt estate. I wasn't just a guest at this party. I was the estate's senior curator and private manager. I held the master keys, both physical and digital, to the entire property. Pushing off the wall, I straightened my posture. The dizziness from my fever receded, eclipsed by a sudden, surging adrenaline. I needed proof. I needed the kind of irrefutable evidence that Beatrice could not manipulate, spin, or gaslight her way out of. I slipped away from the alcove, moving deliberately against the flow of the glamorous crowd, navigating the familiar labyrinth of the mansion's corridors. I bypassed the bustling catering kitchens and the temporary coat checks, heading toward the restricted East Wing. At the end of a long, dimly lit hallway, I reached a set of heavy, reinforced mahogany doors. A discreet brass placard read, "Private, no entry." I reached into my small clutch and withdrew a heavy, black keycard. I tapped it against the hidden scanner beneath the wood molding. The locking mechanism disengaged with a solid, satisfying click. I pushed the door open and stepped into my sanctuary. The air here was temperature-controlled, smelling faintly of linseed oil and aged paper. The walls were lined with breathtaking masterpieces, illuminated by specialized, low UV lighting. I bypassed the art, moving straight toward the small, glass-walled administrative office nestled in the back corner. I sat at my sleek, familiar desk, the heavy mahogany a stark contrast to the fragile state of my body. Booting up the secure terminal, I logged into the estate's master rental and security ledger. The interface glowed on the screen, a sophisticated network of bookings, financial transactions, and background checks. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing in Beatrice and the date of the engagement party. The file populated instantly. I clicked open the rental agreement, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. There it was. Not only had Beatrice used my joint account to wire the $45,000 deposit, but she had also submitted a forged financial statement to prove she had the collateral required to rent the property. She had listed my apartment, my modest investment portfolio, and my art collection as her own assets. But the most damning piece of evidence was the signature line. Below Beatrice's elegant script was my name, Haley, perfectly forged as the secondary guarantor. She had committed outright fraud. She had legally bound me to this extravagant charade. A bitter, humorless smile touched my lips. I downloaded the entire dossier, the wire transfer receipts, the forged contract, and the fraudulent asset declarations, saving them directly to my secure cloud drive, ensuring I could access them from my phone. I had the weapon I needed. Now, it was time to step onto the battlefield. I locked the east wing behind me and walked back toward the chaotic brilliance of the ballroom. The string quartet had been replaced by a lively jazz band, and the dance floor was crowded with Preston's wealthy relatives. I scanned the room, my eyes narrowing as I searched for my sister. I spotted Isabella standing near an elaborate, towering champagne fountain, temporarily separated from Preston, who was deep in conversation with an older gentleman smoking a cigar. I approached her slowly, my heart hammering a steady, relentless rhythm against my ribs. Isabella looked radiant in a custom-fitted white silk gown, her hair cascading in perfect, shining waves. "Isabella," I said softly, stepping into her line of sight. She turned, her manicured eyebrows pulling together in a momentary frown before she smoothed her features into a polite, if slightly strained, smile. "Haley, Mom said you were hiding in a corner somewhere. You really do look awful, you know. Are you sure you shouldn't be at home?" "I needed to speak with you," I said, ignoring the jab. "Alone, just for a minute." Isabella sighed, a delicate, dramatic sound, and checked her diamond-encrusted watch. "Make it quick, Haley. Preston's grandmother wants to do the official toast in 15 minutes, and I need to touch up my lipstick." "Do you know how Mom paid for this party?" I asked, keeping my voice incredibly calm, devoid of the hysteria I had felt earlier that morning. Isabella laughed, a light, dismissive sound that reminded me painfully of Beatrice. "What kind of question is that? Her investments, obviously. Her portfolio has been doing very well lately. She wanted everything to be perfect for Preston's family." "She doesn't have an investment portfolio, Isabella," I said gently, watching the confusion flicker in her eyes. "Her boutique has been running at a loss for 3 years. She's drowning in credit card debt." "That's a lie," Isabella snapped, her posture instantly defensive. "You're just jealous. You've always been jealous that Mom and I are close, that I'm marrying into a good family while you—" She gestured vaguely at my simple dress. "She stole $45,000 from my emergency savings account this morning," I continued, my voice unwavering. "She drained my life savings to pay the deposit on this estate." Isabella opened her mouth to argue, her face flushing with indignant anger, but before she could speak, a sharp, manicured hand clamped down on my shoulder. The grip was tight enough to bruise. "What in the world are you doing?" Beatrice hissed, materializing from the crowd like a sleek, angry phantom. She stepped between Isabella and me, effectively shielding her favorite daughter from my words. "I thought I told you to stay out of the way, Haley." "She's telling crazy lies, Mom," Isabella said, her voice trembling slightly, though whether from anger or a sudden, dawning doubt, I couldn't tell. "She's saying you stole from her to pay for tonight." Beatrice didn't flinch. Her expression shifted instantly into a mask of deep maternal pity. It was a performance worthy of an Academy Award. She looked at me with faux sorrow, shaking her head. "Oh, Haley, my poor, sweet girl. I told you the fever was making you delirious." She turned to Isabella, her voice dropping to a loud, theatrical whisper. "She's been so terribly ill, sweetheart. The doctor warned me that the high fever might cause hallucinations and paranoia. She doesn't know what she's saying." "I am not hallucinating," I said, stepping closer so Beatrice couldn't break eye contact. "You wired the money to Vanderbilt Estate Rentals at 8 o'clock this morning. I saw the bank alert." "Stop this right now," Beatrice commanded, the pity vanishing, replaced by a cold, desperate fury. "You are embarrassing yourself, and you are trying to ruin your sister's special night. You have always been a bitter, spiteful child, incapable of celebrating anyone else's happiness. If you say one more word about this fabricated nonsense, I will have security throw you out into the street. Do you hear me?" The threat hung in the air between us, heavy and venomous. Beatrice stood tall, her chin raised in defiance, absolutely confident that her intimidation tactics would work. She expected me to cower. She expected me to apologize and shrink back into the shadows, terrified of making a scene. Beside her, Isabella looked conflicted, her eyes darting between my pale, resolute face and our mother's furious glare. "Mom, maybe she really is sick," Isabella murmured, playing right into Beatrice's hands, desperate to maintain the illusion of her perfect evening. "Maybe she should just go home." "Yes," Beatrice agreed eagerly, a triumphant smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. "She should leave immediately. In fact, I'll make sure of it." Beatrice turned abruptly and raised her hand, snapping her fingers sharply toward a large man in a tailored black suit standing near the courtyard doors. It was the estate's private security detail. "Excuse me, officer," Beatrice called out, projecting her voice just loudly enough to catch his attention without alerting the entire room. "We have a situation here. A guest who has become unstable and disruptive. I need her escorted off the premises immediately." The security guard nodded and began weaving his way through the crowd toward us. My heart beat a rapid drumline against my ribs, but I did not move. I planted my feet firmly on the marble floor. As the guard approached, his stern expression suddenly shifted. His eyes widened slightly as he recognized me. "Ms. Haley." The guard, a man named Marcus whom I had hired 2 years ago, said, stopping a few feet away. His authoritative posture relaxed into one of deep respect. "I didn't realize you were on site tonight. Is everything all right? Do you need assistance with this guest?" He gestured politely toward Beatrice. Beatrice's triumphant smirk froze on her face. Her eyes darted from Marcus to me, a profound, uncomprehending confusion washing over her features. What did you just call her?" Beatrice stammered, her voice losing its polished edge. "She is my daughter. She is sick and she needs to be removed." "Marcus is confused, Mom," I said, pulling my cell phone from my clutch. "Because normally, I'm the one who gives him orders, not the other way around." I unlocked my screen and pulled up the downloaded dossier. I bypassed Beatrice entirely and held the phone up so Isabella could clearly see the screen. "Look at this, Isabella," I instructed, my voice cutting through the jazz music like a knife. "This is the official wire transfer log from my bank. Look at the account numbers. Look at the total." Isabella leaned in, her eyes scanning the glowing screen. The color rapidly drained from her face as the undeniable digital proof registered in her mind. "Wait, 45,000 from the joint account." "Now look at this," I continued, swiping to the next document. It was the rental contract. "This is the application Mom submitted to rent this estate. Read the guarantor section." Isabella's breath hitched. That's your name," but she said. "It's a forgery," I stated flatly, finally looking back at Beatrice, whose face had gone completely white, her meticulously applied makeup suddenly looking like a clown's mask over pale, terrified skin. "She forged my signature. She claimed my assets as her own to secure this venue. That isn't just a lie, Isabella. That is felony fraud." "Give me that phone." Beatrice suddenly shrieked, lunging forward, all pretense of high society grace vanishing in an instant. Her perfectly manicured hands clawed toward my device, desperate to destroy the evidence. Marcus stepped forward instantly, easily blocking her path with his broad shoulders, holding a firm hand up to stop her. "Ma'am, please step back. Do not attempt to touch Ms. Haley again." "She's lying. Those are fake documents." Beatrice yelled, her voice bordering on hysterical. A few heads from the nearby tables turned in our direction, drawn by the sudden commotion. Preston, having noticed the disturbance, was now walking briskly toward us, a scowl on his handsome, arrogant face. Isabella stared at Beatrice, the carefully constructed fantasy of her affluent life shattering right before her eyes. "Mom, is it true?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Did you steal from Haley? Did you forge her name?" Beatrice looked at her golden child, her mouth opening and closing as she desperately searched for another lie, another manipulation, another way to maintain control. But she was cornered, and the stakes had just been raised far beyond anything she could handle. "What in the world is going on here?" The sharp, arrogant voice cut through the tense atmosphere like a scythe. Preston pushed his way through the small, curious crowd that had begun to gather around our dispute. He looked irritated, his handsome face marred by a deep scowl, his bespoke tuxedo perfectly tailored to his rigid posture. Behind him, looking equally displeased, were his parents, the patriarch and matriarch of old money, their expressions pinched with a mixture of confusion and high society distaste. The jazz band had finished their set, and the sudden, echoing silence in the ballroom made every word spoken feel magnified. Beatrice immediately lunged toward Preston, her hands desperately grasping his forearm as if he were a life raft in a turbulent ocean. Her voice jumped an octave, pitching into a frantic, sickly sweet whine. "Preston, darling, thank goodness you're here. It's nothing, really. Haley is just. She's having a terrible reaction to her medication. She's completely delirious, speaking absolute nonsense. I was just having security escort her out before she caused a scene and ruined Isabella's beautiful night." Preston sneered, his gaze sweeping over my pale face and simple dress with undisguised contempt. "I told you we shouldn't have invited her, Beatrice. People like her, people who dwell in the shadows and play with old trinkets, they simply cannot handle this echelon of society. They get bitter. Isabella, tell your sister to leave before my parents lose their patience." Isabella stood frozen, the color still entirely drained from her cheeks. She looked from the digital evidence glowing on my phone screen to Preston's sneering face, and finally to our mother's desperate, lying eyes. For the first time in her life, the golden child was seeing the puppet strings that had orchestrated her entire existence. "She's not lying, Preston," Isabella whispered, her voice barely carrying over the hushed whispers of the surrounding guests. Preston's scowl deepened. "What did you say?" "I said she isn't lying," Isabella repeated, her voice cracking, tears suddenly welling in her eyes. "Mom stole her money. Haley just showed me the bank transfers. Mom drained her life savings to pay for this party." The gasp that rippled through the immediate crowd was audible. Preston's mother, a formidable woman dripping in heirloom diamonds, stepped forward, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. "Is this true, Beatrice? Did you steal money to finance this engagement party?" Beatrice was shaking now, a visible, full-body tremor of absolute panic. "No, no, Mrs. Kensington, please, you must understand, it was a joint account. It was family money. And my business is simply restructuring." "You committed felony fraud, Mother," I projected my voice, making sure it carried to the back of the room. The adrenaline was coursing through my veins now, entirely banishing the weakness of my pneumonia. I felt tall. I felt immovable. "You forged my signature as a secondary guarantor on the lease agreement for this estate. You claimed my assets, my apartment, and my professional collection as your own to pass the financial background check. You lied to the rental agency, you lied to Preston's family, and you stole everything I had." Preston's father let out a sharp, disgusted scoff. "You forged financial documents. Good God, Beatrice, you're not just a social climber, you're a common criminal." "It's not what it looks like," Beatrice wailed, her carefully constructed facade completely obliterating. Tears of pure terror streamed down her face, ruining her expensive makeup, leaving dark streaks of mascara down her cheeks. "I did it for Isabella. I did it so she could have this life. We belong here." "You don't belong anywhere near us," Preston spat, physically recoiling from Beatrice and taking a step away from Isabella as if her poverty were contagious. Before Beatrice could launch into another hysterical defense, a heavy, resounding silence fell over the massive entrance to the ballroom. The whispers ceased entirely. Even the breathing of the crowd seemed to halt. The towering mahogany doors had been opened by the valet staff, and standing in the threshold was a man who required no introduction in this city or any city in the world. Julian Vance. He was in his late 50s, his silver hair impeccably styled, wearing a charcoal suit that spoke of wealth so vast it didn't need to shout. He exuded an aura of absolute, terrifying authority. The crowd of millionaires and socialites instinctively parted for him like the Red Sea, their eyes wide with shock and awe. Julian Vance did not attend social events. He was a notorious recluse, managing his global tech and real estate empire from behind closed doors. He walked slowly, deliberately, straight toward the center of our conflict. Preston's father immediately stood taller, a sycophantic smile stretching across his face as he prepared to greet the billionaire. But Julian didn't even glance at the Kensingtons. His piercing blue eyes were locked entirely on me. He stopped a few feet away, his expression softening into one of deep professional respect. "Haley," Julian said, his deep, resonant voice echoing in the dead, silent room. "I apologize for the intrusion. I know you requested this weekend off for your recovery, but the Zurich acquisition has hit a critical snag regarding the provenance of the Renaissance collection. The jet is waiting on the tarmac. Are you well enough to fly?" The entire ballroom seemed to collectively stop breathing. Beatrice's jaw hung slack, her eyes practically bulging out of her head. Preston looked as though he had been struck by lightning. "Mr. Vance," I replied, my voice steady and calm. "I am feeling much better, thank you. However, I am currently dealing with a slight security breach regarding the estate." "Security breach?" Julian arched an elegant eyebrow, his gaze slowly turning to survey the Kensingtons, Preston, and finally, settling on Beatrice's ruined, trembling face. "Explain." "This woman," I gestured to Beatrice, "has fraudulently rented this property by forging my signature and falsely claiming my assets." Julian's eyes turned to ice. He looked at Beatrice not with anger, but with the cold, detached disgust one might reserve for a cockroach on a pristine floor. "I see," he murmured, "and she is aware of your position." "No, sir," I replied quietly. "My family has always been under the impression that my work is merely a dusty hobby." Julian Vance let out a low, humorless chuckle that sent shivers down the spines of everyone listening. He turned his imposing frame fully toward Beatrice. "Madam," Julian's voice was a quiet, dangerous rumble. "The woman you are attempting to humiliate is my senior estate manager and the chief curator of my entire global portfolio. She does not merely work with art. She manages assets worth more than the combined net worth of every single person in this room." He paused, letting the weight of his words crush the air out of the Kensingtons and my mother. "Furthermore, through a series of private holding trusts, I am the owner of the Vanderbilt estate. Haley is the only reason this property is ever leased to the public. She holds the master authority over its use." Beatrice let out a strangled, pathetic gasp, taking a stumbling step backward. Her entire reality, the hierarchy she worshipped, had just inverted and crushed her. "Marcus," Julian called out, not taking his eyes off my mother. The head of security stepped forward immediately. "Yes, Mr. Vance." "Haley's secure terminal flagged a fraudulent signature match on the lease agreement an hour ago," Julian stated. "Have the local authorities been dispatched?" "Yes, sir. They arrived at the front gates 2 minutes ago. They are waiting for my signal." "Give it," Julian commanded. He then turned to Preston's family. "I suggest you vacate my property. Immediately. I do not tolerate the presence of individuals who associate with thieves." The fallout was instantaneous and absolute. Preston's mother let out a scandalized shriek, grabbing her husband's arm. "Preston, we are leaving. Now, this is the most disgraceful thing I have ever witnessed. Our family will not be dragged into a common criminal investigation." Preston didn't need to be told twice. He turned on Isabella, his face twisted in a mask of ugly, elitist fury. "This is over. You and your pathetic, scheming mother are entirely finished in this city. Don't ever contact me again." He turned his back on his fiancé without a second glance, marching after his parents as they practically sprinted toward the exit. Isabella didn't cry. She didn't beg him to stay. She simply stood there, staring at the space where the man she was supposed to marry had just stood, the illusion of his love evaporating into thin air. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she reached down to her left hand. She slid the massive, ostentatious diamond ring off her finger. She walked over to a nearby table and dropped the ring into a half-empty glass of champagne. It sank to the bottom with a quiet clink. 2 uniformed police officers strode into the ballroom, their heavy boots thudding against the marble. Marcus directed them straight to Beatrice. "Beatrice," the lead officer asked, pulling a pair of metal handcuffs from his belt. "We are placing you under arrest for suspicion of felony wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. You have the right to remain silent." No, no, Haley, please. Beatrice shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings as the officers forcefully turned her around and snapped the cuffs onto her wrists. The sound of the metal locking was the loudest thing in the room. Haley, tell them to stop. I'm your mother. You can't do this to your own mother. I raised you. I did everything for you. I looked at the woman who had tormented me, used me, and discarded me my entire life. I felt no triumph in her tears, only a profound, hollow exhaustion. You did this to yourself, Beatrice, I said quietly, using her first name, severing the final thread of our toxic bond. I spent my life trying to save you. Today, I finally realized you were never drowning. You were just trying to pull me under. Take her away, officers. Beatrice's wails faded down the long, luxurious hallway as she was escorted out of the mansion, leaving a stunned, silent ballroom in her wake. The remaining guests were already murmuring, grabbing their coats, fleeing the scene of the ultimate social destruction. I turned to look at Isabella. She was standing perfectly still, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes and tracking silently down her face. She looked so young, so incredibly lost. The glamorous facade she had worn all evening had melted away, leaving only a terrified girl whose entire worldview had just been shattered. I walked over to her. I didn't say, "I told you so." I didn't gloat. I reached out and gently wrapped my arms around her shaking shoulders. Isabella collapsed against me, burying her face in my shoulder, and began to sob. Deep, racking, agonizing sobs of grief, betrayal, and profound realization. "I'm so sorry," she choked out, her fingers gripping the fabric of my simple dress. "I'm so sorry, Haley. I was so blind. I let her poison me against you. I thought she loved us. But she only loved the money." "I know," I whispered, resting my chin on the top of her head, holding her tight. "I know, Izzy, it's going to be okay. We're going to be okay. But we have to start over. Completely over. Just us." "I don't have anything," she cried. "I don't even know who I am without her telling me what to be." "You'll figure it out," I promised softly. "And I'll help you, but no more lies, no more pretending." I held her until the ballroom was entirely empty, until the only sound was the distant splashing of the courtyard fountains and the soft hum of the estate's massive air conditioning units. Julian Vance stood a respectful distance away, patiently waiting, observing the wreckage with quiet understanding. When Isabella finally pulled back, wiping her eyes, I gave her a reassuring smile. I called her a private car, ensuring she got back to her apartment safely, away from the impending media circus that would inevitably surround Beatrice's arrest. As the taillights of Isabella's car disappeared down the long, sweeping driveway, I took a deep breath of the cool night air. The tightness in my chest was gone. The fever had broken completely. Julian stepped up beside me, buttoning his suit jacket. "A dramatic evening, Miss Haley. Are you prepared to depart for Switzerland?" I looked up at my boss, the billionaire who had unknowingly facilitated my ultimate vindication, and then I looked back at the grand Vanderbilt estate, my domain, my sanctuary. "I am, Mr. Vance," I smiled, feeling a genuine lightness in my soul for the first time in a decade. "Let's go." The following months played out exactly as I had anticipated, but with a finality that brought me absolute peace. Beatrice's trial was swift and brutal. With the digital evidence I had secured, her defense crumbled. She was convicted of multiple felonies and sentenced to 3 years in a minimum security facility, followed by 5 years of probation. The boutique was liquidated, her assets were seized to pay back the creditors she had defrauded, and she was permanently exiled from the high society circles she had sacrificed everything to infiltrate. I eventually recovered the $45,000 through the bank's fraud protection insurance, returning it to my secure, private accounts. But the greatest restoration project of my life wasn't a painting or a mansion. It was my relationship with my sister. Isabella moved into a modest apartment of her own. Stripped of the designer clothes and the toxic influence of our mother, she discovered a resilience she never knew she possessed. I offered to pay for her to go back to school, to finish the degree she had abandoned for her influencer dreams. She accepted, but insisted on working part-time at a local cafe to pay for her own rent and groceries. We started having coffee every Sunday morning, learning how to be sisters without the shadow of Beatrice's manipulation hanging over us. We were building a foundation on truth, and it was stronger than any mansion I had ever managed. As for me, I continued my work with Julian Vance, traveling the world, restoring lost treasures, and managing estates that held centuries of secrets. I spent my days surrounded by beauty, but I no longer hid in the shadows. I had reclaimed my life, my finances, and my family, proving that true wealth isn't measured by the car you drive or the parties you attend, but by the undeniable strength of standing in the light and refusing to be silenced ever again.